we continue the story of this legendary personality. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you are ready, here we go. When Neville Chamberlain succeeded Baldwin as Prime Minister, Churchill's relationship with the Conservatives worsened, and while his information about Germany's aggressive plans was consistently accurate, his warnings were ignored. When German pressure intensified on Czechoslovakia, Churchill insisted that the government issue a joint declaration with France and the Soviet Union, and when the Munich Agreement was signed with Hitler in 1938, ceding Czechoslovakia to the Nazis, Churchill declared that this represented a real defeat. Meanwhile, public opinion began to recognize Churchill as the spokesman of the nation and pressed for his reinstatement, but Prime Minister Chamberlain ignored the pressure. When Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, Chamberlain appointed Churchill to his old post as Minister of the Admiralty. Despite all his efforts, Churchill was unable to mobilize the Anglo-French Entente during the lull before the German invasion of Norway in April 1940, and the failure of the Narvik and Trondheim campaigns, which relied on naval support, was reminiscent of the Gallipoli campaign in the First World War, but this time Chamberlain was blamed. Following the invasion of Norway, Germany's invasion of the Benelux countries on May 10, 1940, was a great shock for Britain, and Churchill became Prime Minister instead of Chamberlain, who resigned. Forming a coalition government representing all tendencies except the extreme right and left, Churchill assumed the post of Defense Minister as well as the Speaker of the House of Commons. In order to make decisions quickly, the government was headed by a 5-person war cabinet, but all groups and parties were represented in the government under his control. His war policy and good relations with U.S. President Roosevelt made Churchill one of the most important statesmen in British history. On May 13, 1940, Churchill made his first speech as Prime Minister in the House of Commons, saying that he had nothing to offer but blood, struggle, tears, and sweat. Churchill's war policy was based on the principle that every British citizen, regardless of political affiliation, should join the struggle in unity and solidarity against the enemy Hitler's Germany. After the defeat of the Allies and the evacuation of Dunkirk by British forces, Churchill warned the Parliament that the invasion was a real danger and should be met with decisive resistance, and made great efforts to keep France in the war. But when his efforts failed, the British war began. In the middle of the war, with a cigar in his mouth and a victory sign with his hand, Churchill walked around the defense lines and made realistic statements to the public without losing his unique sense of humor. Churchill, who sometimes had to take decisions that led to bitter consequences and controversy, had the French fleet bombed to prevent it from falling into Hitler's hands. When the threat of invasion reached its peak, British power in the eastern Mediterranean was increased and forces were sent to Greece. However, the subsequent evacuation of British forces from Crete was perceived as a new Gallipoli defeat, and Churchill was heavily criticized in Parliament. In these difficult days, the U.S. provided military aid to Britain, but there was no alliance between the two countries. However, the solidarity between the two countries was further strengthened with the meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt in Newfoundland, Canada, in August 1941, and the subsequent announcement of the Atlantic Charter, which established common principles between the U.S. and Britain. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Churchill called for help for the Russian people in a radio broadcast on June 22, 1941, saying that the danger to the Russians was a danger to the British. He then began to form the Grand Alliance that would include the Soviet Union and the United States. As a result, a 20-year mutual aid treaty was signed between Britain and the Soviet Union in May 1942. However, Churchill, who was afraid of the Soviet Union's influence in the Balkans, tried to bring Turkey, which had great strategic importance, into the war from the beginning of the war. In his meetings with Turkish leaders in Cairo and Adana, he refused to provide the military aid Turkey requested. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Churchill went to Washington, and as a result of his talks with Roosevelt, an agreement was reached between the two countries on the linking of military and economic resources to unified boards and chiefs of staff, the establishment of unity of command on all fronts where the war continued, and that the defeat of Germany preceded the defeat of Japan. In 1942, Churchill, with the strength of his closeness with Roosevelt, prevented the opening of the Second Front, despite pressure from Stalin and the U.S. staff. In the same year, however, he was again heavily criticized for failures in the Far East and Africa. After the Allied landings in North Africa, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Casablanca in January 1943, but Churchill's proposal for an all-out early attack was not accepted. Churchill then traveled to Tripoli, Turkey and Algeria, contracting pneumonia in the process, but did not interrupt his work, traveling to Washington in May and to Quebec in August, where he worked on the plans for Operation Overlord. At the first meeting of the Big Three in Tehran in 1943, he failed to convince Roosevelt of a fully united Anglo-American front. Unlike Stalin, he was unable to hold a bilateral meeting with Roosevelt, and his proposals on Allied offensives in southern Europe were not accepted. Moreover, the issues of the Yalta Conference in 1945 did not interest Roosevelt and Stalin as much as Churchill. Churchill insisted that the Allied forces be moved eastward before the Russians filled the German vacancies in Eastern Europe, but he was unable to convince either Roosevelt or Truman. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, he could not play an effective role in the decisions taken. After his party lost the elections, he had to return to England before the end of the meeting. In the post-war period, Churchill's main interest was foreign policy. In March 1946, in Fulton, Missouri, Churchill explained his views on the post-war world order to President Truman and stated that Britain and the United States should unite as guardians of peace against Soviet communism, which divided Europe with an iron curtain. Churchill, who also advocated the establishment of a European Union, took initiatives to establish the Council of Europe in Zurich in September 1946 and attended the first meeting of the Council in Strasbourg in 1949. The Conservative Party won the elections held in October 1951, and Churchill became Prime Minister for the second time. Domestic problems did not interest Churchill much during this period, and the only issues he was interested in were the steel industry, which had been nationalized by the Labour Party, and the transfer of road transport back to the private sector. In 1953, Churchill received the Order of the Garter from Queen Elizabeth II and the Nobel Prize for Literature. He welcomed his former comrade in arms, Dwight D. Eisenhower, as President of the United States, and, after Stalin's death, he held a meeting in Bermuda in the hope of persuading Eisenhower to hold summit talks with the Russians. This meeting, which was also attended by the French, was more of an exchange of views. Eisenhower was pleased when the Russians agreed to a phased withdrawal of British forces from the Suez Canal, and this led to new hopes of cooperation. Churchill, who resigned his post on April 5, 1955 due to ill health, retained his membership in the House of Commons and was re-elected as an MP in the elections held in 1959. In the meantime, he published his important 4-volume work, A History of English-Speaking Peoples. On April 9, 1963, he was made an honorary American citizen by the U.S. Congress. On January 24, 1965, Churchill died in London and was buried with a state funeral. Churchill, who caused many allegations and criticisms afterwards, lived an extraordinary life. He undoubtedly accomplished very important things for England and perhaps changed the fate of the Second World War. What do you think? Do you think Churchill was a hero or a villain? What do you think was the event that changed the fate of the Second World War? We care about your opinion. Please share it with us.